At the turn of the 20th century, long before retirement communities were a standardized part of American life, there was a curious experiment hidden away in the folds of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was called Willow's Rest, a place built with an unusually singular purpose: to be a sanctuary for the elderly, far removed from the chaos and pace of the industrializing world. The year was 1898 when the first stones were laid, and the planners behind it were not ordinary businessmen, but a coalition of wealthy philanthropists, Civil War veterans, and a small but influential group of religious reformers who believed that the final years of a person's life should be spent in peace, contemplation, and moral preparation. It was their belief that urban America, with its soot-blackened streets and relentless factory whistles, was no place for the old to quietly fade away. Willow's Rest wasn't just an idea, it was a vision meticulously executed. The location alone was a feat of deliberate isolation. To get there from the nearest town, travelers had to take a narrow wagon trail that twisted for miles through pine forests and across steep ravines. The settlement sat on a plateau bordered by sheer cliffs on one side and thick, almost impenetrable woods on the other. It was said that the air was so clean that even those with persistent coughs from the city found themselves breathing more easily within days. Springs fed fresh, cold water to the settlement through a system of hand-carved stone channels, and fruit orchards were planted to ensure a constant supply of food. From the beginning, everything about Willow's Rest was meant to suggest self-sufficiency. The houses were modest but sturdy, built in a neat half-circle around a central communal hall. Each was equipped with its own small garden plot, but the village maintained larger communal fields for vegetables and grains. The hall, with its tall windows and broad hearth, was where meals were served, where hymns were sung on Sundays, and where weekly meetings were held to discuss the needs of the residents. Unlike other rural communities of the time, this one was never meant to grow. There were no provisions for families, no schools, no playgrounds. It was a place where lives would end, not begin, and the founders seemed perfectly content with that reality. Most of the first residents were Civil War veterans and their spouses, many of whom had lived in boarding houses or with distant relatives before moving in. The war had left deep physical and emotional scars on these men, and Willow's Rest promised them not only comfort, but dignity. Records suggest that the average age of the first settlers was over 65, a considerable number in an era when life expectancy hovered around 50. They came from various states, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Ohio, but once within the boundaries of Willow's Rest, they became part of a single, close-knit community. Life in Willow's Rest moved at a slower rhythm. Days began with the ringing of a brass hand bell at sunrise, calling residents to a light breakfast. Mornings were often spent tending to gardens, mending clothes, or helping with upkeep around the hall. Afternoons brought leisure chess games, quilting circles, storytelling under the shade of the old elm trees. Visitors from nearby towns often remarked on how content the residents seemed, though they also noted an unusual formality in how the settlement was run. Every decision, from when to plant the season's first crop to whether a new resident should be admitted, was put to a vote in the weekly meeting. Those who broke the community's agreed-upon rules that were never written down were quietly but firmly told to leave. One of the more curious aspects of Willow's Rest was its funding. While residents contributed what they could from pensions or savings, the village's larger expenses, supplies, livestock, occasional repairs, were covered by a mysterious benefactor whose identity was never made public. Supplies were delivered twice a month by a hired wagon driver who was instructed never to linger, never to step inside the communal hall, and never to ask questions. This arrangement fueled rumors even then. Some said the benefactor was a former officer who had served with many of the residents. Others insisted it was a wealthy industrialist seeking to atone for past wrongs. Whatever the truth, the financial support ensured the settlement's stability for more than a decade. But the isolation that gave Willow's Rest its charm also gave it an air of secrecy. Outsiders were rarely invited in. Letters from residents were infrequent, often strangely short, and usually avoided any mention of the village's inner workings. A few visitors reported subtle oddities, residents who avoided eye contact when asked about their pasts, or the way conversations would abruptly stop if certain topics were mentioned. Yet despite this, there was no clear indication of danger. Life seemed tranquil, even idyllic, for those inside. Not by 1910. The community's population had reached its peak 53 residents in total, nearly all over the age of 70. It was at this point that the founder's vision began to attract wider attention. Local newspapers ran brief but glowing mentions of Willow's Rest as a model for the future care of our elders. There was talk in certain circles about replicating the idea in other states. Yet even in this growing recognition, the settlement remained aloof, refusing invitations to speak publicly about its operations or allow journalists to stay overnight. It was almost as though the residents themselves wanted to remain a footnote, a curiosity that could be admired from afar but never truly examined. And then, in the early months of 1912, subtle changes began to ripple through the quiet routine. The twice-monthly wagon deliveries were increased to weekly visits, though no one outside the community knew why. The driver later claimed he began to notice small but unsettling signs. Fewer people coming out to greet him, parcels left uncollected. Until the next delivery, curtains drawn in homes that had once stood open to the sun. The brass bell, once a morning constant, seemed to ring at odd hours, sometimes long before dawn, sometimes not at all. Whatever the reason for these changes, it remained hidden from the outside world. To those who knew of Willow's Rest only by reputation, nothing seemed amiss. But for those few who interacted with the settlement directly, there was a quiet sense that something in the air had shifted, that the peaceful sanctuary had taken. On a strange, watchful stillness dot, no one then could have guessed that within months, Willow's Rest would become the setting for one of the most perplexing disappearances in American history. It began, according to the earliest accounts, with something so small that no one thought to investigate it at first. A shopkeeper in the nearest town, a place called Milford, noticed that the delivery driver who serviced Willow's Rest returned from his usual run much sooner than expected. When asked about it, the driver said he hadn't needed to unload all the supplies that week. No one had come out to meet him. He'd left the crates of flour, dried beans, and lamp oil stacked neatly outside the communal hall door, as was the custom. But there had been no cheerful wave from Mrs. Abernathy, no gentle thanks from old Sergeant Willis, no sound of the brass bell ringing to announce the arrival of goods. It was a quiet day in the mountains, but it seemed quieter still in the village itself. At first, Milford's residents assumed the elders were ill, or perhaps engaged in some private gathering. Willow's Rest had always been a little peculiar, in that way private, deliberate, keeping its affairs to itself. But within days, more signs began to accumulate. Smoke no longer rose from the chimneys at dusk. The faint strains of hymns, which locals swore they could sometimes hear drifting through the valley on a still Sunday morning, fell silent. A postman reported that 3 weeks' worth of mail addressed to the settlement remained uncollected. At the Milford post office, when the driver returned for his next delivery, the crates from the previous week were still there, untouched, with the second week's supplies stacked beside them like a neglected offering dot. It was then that a few of Milford's men decided to walk the winding path up to Willow's Rest themselves. The road was narrow and treacherous, and the trip was not made lightly, especially in early spring, when the mountain air was sharp and unpredictable. They set out in the morning and reached the plateau just before noon. The village lay still, beneath a weak, pale sun. From a distance, It appeared as it always had, neat rows of houses, the central hall standing watch like a sentinel over the green. But as they approached, the stillness became something else entirely, something oppressive. Doors were closed, but not locked, as if no one inside had bothered to secure them. Curtains hung unmoved by any draft, and the usual sense of wood smoke. And cooked meals were absent. The air smelled only of damp soil and pine knot inside the homes. The men found scenes that made their hair rise. Meals had been left half-eaten on wooden tables, bread gone hard, soup congealed in bowls. In one cottage, a rocking chair swayed gently, as though someone had risen from it only moments before. Knitting needles rested mid-stitch in a ball of yarn. An open book lay face down on a chair. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. The absence of the villagers was so complete and so sudden that it felt less like they had walked away and more as though they had simply ceased to exist. The communal hall was the same. A pot hung over the cold hearth, filled with a thin vegetable stew that had long since spoiled. On the long central table, plates and cups sat where they had been placed, each with a small portion of food, as though a meal had been interrupted and never resumed. A Bible lay open near the head of the table, its pages marked by the curl of dried edges. There was no note, no farewell message, no record of where they had gone. When the searchers fanned out to check the gardens and orchards, they found the same eerie abandonment. Early crops had been planted, but left untended. Weeds had begun to creep between the rows. Tools were scattered haphazardly, some left out in the open where they had been dropped. A wheelbarrow half filled with soil stood in the orchard, its handles wet with dew. One of the men remarked that it was as if every resident had stepped away at the exact same moment, with no thought of returning. The group spent the rest of the day combing the area, shouting the names of those they knew, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The surrounding woods were silent, except for the occasional cry of a distant bird. No footprints led away from the settlement. The only tracks visible were the fading ruts from the delivery wagon weeks before. When night began to fall, the searchers reluctantly decided to head back to Milford, promising to return with a larger party. News of the strange scene spread quickly through the small mountain towns. By the following morning, a more organized search was underway, with local volunteers and a few county officials making the trek to Willow's Rest. Their arrival did nothing to dispel the mystery. Every home was searched again, every cupboard opened, every bed inspected. Clothing remained neatly folded in chests, personal effects untouched. Jewelry sat on dressers. Coins lay in small piles by bedside tables. There was no sign that the residents had packed for a journey. It was as though they had vanished in the middle of their daily routines, leaving everything behind. Some of the searchers later spoke of a strange atmosphere that hung over the village. The silence was deeper than any they had experienced in the mountains, as if the usual sounds of wind through the trees or the scurry of small animals had been muted. In one account, a man claimed he heard faint singing when he stepped into the central green, soft, wordless tones that stopped the moment he tried to pinpoint their source. Others dismissed this as nerves or imagination, but it was not the only report of odd sounds or sensations. Several searchers complained of feeling watched. Though there was no one to be seen. As the days passed, theories began to form, though none fit neatly with the facts. Some believed illness had struck the community, prompting the survivors to leave in search of help. But there were no bodies, no signs of mass sickness, no discarded medicine bottles, no hastily packed belongings. Others whispered about wolves or bears, but the idea of a wild animal attack was quickly dismissed. There was no blood, no signs of violence, and certainly no way such predators could spirit away an entire settlement in one stroke. One story passed quietly from person to person, came from a railway worker who had been repairing a section of track miles from the village. He claimed that on an overcast morning in late March, he had seen a procession moving through the trees far off in the hills, figures dressed in pale clothing, walking in a single file line, heads bowed, silent. He could not say how many there were, but the number seemed more than a dozen, less than 50. When he looked again, they were gone. The detail was dismissed by officials, but it lingered in the minds of those who heard it. Fitting too neatly with the village's missing population dot, by the end of the first week, the supplies stacked outside. The communal hall had been moved into storage by the search teams, but no one wanted to stay in the village longer than necessary. Nights on the plateau were cold, and though a few volunteers attempted to camp there, most abandoned the effort after a single night, citing uneasy dreams and a pervasive sense that they were not alone. The official search eventually shifted, its focus to the surrounding wilderness, but no trace of the missing residents was ever found. No campsites, no discarded possessions, no graves. It was as though Willow's Rest had been emptied in an instant, leaving behind only the shell of a place that had once been alive. The last to leave the plateau that spring were 2 deputies from the RCO, County Sheriff's Office. They locked the communal hall out of formality, though both admitted later they felt the gesture was meaningless. There was no one left to keep in or out. The path back to Milford was long and winding, and when they reached the base of the mountain, they looked back one final time. The village was already fading into the mist, silent and still, a place frozen in the moment its people had disappeared. The searchers who first stepped into the cottages of Willow's Rest spoke often of the stillness, but it was the details, those small, intimate traces of life left behind, that disturbed them most. It was not a ghost town in the usual sense, with broken windows and collapsed roofs. Everything was intact, perfectly preserved, as if the residents had stepped outside for a moment and simply never returned. And everywhere they looked, there were unfinished gestures, fragments of routine arrested in time. In one of the smaller cottages near the edge of the settlement, a tea set sat on a round table by the window. The teapot was still half full, its contents long cold and clouded, and 2 cups were placed neatly on saucers, as if awaiting guests. On the sill above the table was a small vase holding what had once been fresh daisies, now wilted and brittle. A wooden chair had been pushed back slightly from the table, angled as though someone had risen quickly, not with alarm, but with quiet purpose. Nearby, a coat still hung on a peg, its sleeves limp but ready for a waiting pair of arms. The hearth was cold, though a small pile of kindling sat prepared beside it, waiting for a match that would never come. Another cottage told a similar story. In a room heavy with the smell of stale air, a scarf lay across the lap of a rocking chair. Half knitted, the yarn stretched taut to a set of needles. A small ball of wool rested on the floor where it had rolled, leaving a faint trail across the rug. The chair itself was still angled toward the fireplace, as if the person had been sitting there only hours earlier, hands busy, eyes perhaps glancing toward the window, now and then to watch the trees sway. A tin of biscuits sat open on the mantel, with 2 missing and crumbs scattered on the cloth below. On a nearby shelf, a calendar marked the days with neat pencil strokes, each square crossed out up until March 28th. The days after that were blank. The communal hall carried an even more unsettling sense of abandonment. The long wooden table in the center still bore the remnants of a meal. There was no sign of disorder, no plates overturned or chairs knocked over, but the scene felt wrong in a way no one could quite name. Bowls of vegetable stew sat untouched, with spoons resting inside as though frozen mid-stir. A loaf of bread, partially sliced, lay on a cutting board. Beside it, a knife glinted in the weak daylight streaming through the hall's high windows. The Bible on the table had been left open to a passage in the book of Ecclesiastes, the page corners curled from the damp. No one could say if that was significant or simply coincidence, but more than one visitor found themselves unwilling to read the words aloud. Bedrooms offered no comfort. Beds were made in some cottages, half made in others, with blankets pulled back as though someone had just climbed out of them. Clothes hung neatly in wardrobes. Shoes were left in pairs beside doors. In one home, a letter lay on a writing desk. Half finished, the ink faded but still legible. It began as a simple reply to a distant nephew, describing the early spring weather and the planting of beans in the communal garden. The last line trailed off mid-sentence. "We have all been called to," followed by nothing, not even a blot of ink. The pen had been set carefully in its holder. Even the garden seemed to echo the interruption. Rows of vegetables had been neatly planted, the soil freshly turned, but weeds were already beginning to push through. Tools were left where they had been dropped, a hoe leaning against a fence, a trowel buried halfway into the dirt. In the orchard, baskets of early apples sat beneath 2 trees, their contents beginning to rot. A child's carved wooden toy lay abandoned in the grass nearby, though no children were known to have lived in Willow's Rest for several years. This discovery prompted whispered questions about whether someone younger had been staying there secretly, or whether the toy had been kept as a memento. What struck the searchers most was the absence of any signs of haste. There were no packed bags left by the door, no valuables gathered together for a journey. Jewelry, coins, and keepsakes remained in plain view, untouched. If the residents had intended to leave, they had taken nothing with them. It was this lack of preparation that gave the village its uncanny air, as though every person had simply turned away from whatever they were doing and walked into the same invisible doorway at the same moment. Not every detail could be explained. In one cottage, 3 chairs were arranged in a perfect triangle in the center of the room, none of them facing the hearth or table. A small bowl of water sat on the floor in the middle, undisturbed, with a single white feather floating on its surface. The window above the scene had been left open despite the chill, allowing the mountain wind to stir the curtains. In another home, a clock had stopped at precisely 2:47, its pendulum frozen. The glass over the face was unbroken, and no one could say why it had stopped, or whether the time held any meaning. The investigators who documented the interiors often remarked on the oppressive quiet. Even their own footsteps seemed muted inside the houses, as though the rooms had absorbed sound. More than one person claimed to feel watched while standing in the doorways, though there was no movement outside, no flicker of shadow that could be mistaken for a human form. The sensation would vanish the moment they stepped back into the open air, replaced by the ordinary sounds of wind in the trees and the distant call of birds. When these findings were brought back to Milford, the townspeople reacted with a mix of fascination and unease. Some took the unfinished tasks and meals as signs of a sudden emergency, perhaps a natural disaster or urgent call to action. Others saw them as proof of something stranger, something beyond human understanding. The fact that every home told the same story of life paused mid-motion gave the disappearance an almost ritual quality, as though the act of leaving had been coordinated down to the smallest detail. Over the following weeks, a few curious outsiders made the journey to see the village for themselves. They found what the first searchers had described, though the decay had advanced. Bread-growing mold, tea evaporated to a sticky residue, the air heavy with the smell of rot and damp wood, yet the arrangement of objects remained unchanged. The scarf was still in the rocking chair. The tea set still waited on the table. The half-written letter still rested on the desk, the sentence forever unfinished. Those who entered Willow's Rest after the disappearance often left quickly, citing a growing sense of disorientation the longer they stayed. Time seemed to slip. In strange ways inside the cottage's minutes felt longer than they should. Conversations drifted without clear purpose, and the light through the windows appeared to dim earlier than in the surrounding forest. Whether these were tricks of the mind or something else entirely, no one could say. The preservation of these everyday moments, the scarf, the bread, the unfinished letter gave the mystery of Willow's Rest its most haunting dimension. It was not the emptiness that unsettled people, but the intimacy of what remained. The village had not been abandoned in ruin or despair. It had been left in perfect order, with the quiet hum of life still lingering in its corners, waiting for the moment when someone might return to finish what they had started. But no one ever did. From the very first reports, the story of Willow's Rest seemed almost designed to breed speculation. There was so little evidence to anchor the imagination, and what scraps did exist only deepened the sense of something profoundly unusual. The absence of bodies, the lack of struggle, the stillness of the homes, these were not the hallmarks of an ordinary disappearance. People began to fill the void with their own explanations, each theory more elaborate than the last, each one weaving fact and rumor into an increasingly tangled knot. Not one of the first ideas to take root was that the entire community had succumbed to some sudden and devastating illness. The early 20th century was still a time when outbreaks of influenza, typhoid, or even smallpox could wipe out entire households in days. Perhaps people suggested the elders of Willow's Rest had been struck down in rapid succession, their bodies buried somewhere nearby by the last survivors, who then left in despair or delirium. But the searchers had found no mass graves, no disturbed earth, no signs of hasty burials. Food in the homes had not been contaminated. Water in the stone channels still ran clear, and no one in the surrounding towns fell ill in the weeks after. The village was found empty. The illness theory faltered under its own lack of evidence, but it lingered in whispers all the same. Another explanation leaned into more deliberate action. Perhaps the residents had simply decided to leave together, en masse, for reasons unknown. This led to speculation about religious motives. The founders of Willow's Rest had included reformers with strong moral and spiritual ideals, and although there was no known record of the village practicing anything outside mainstream Protestant traditions, rumors began to grow. People spoke of a calling or a vision, something that might have convinced the entire population to depart at the same moment. Supporters of this theory often pointed to the half-written letter found in one of the cottages. "We have all been called to," as if it were a clue to the nature of their departure. The most dramatic religious version of this theory was that of ascension. It was not a concept most locals took seriously, but in the quiet corners of taverns and general stores, the story took on a life of its own. The villagers, some said, had prepared themselves for a great spiritual departure, dressing in their best clothes, gathering at a predetermined place, and then vanishing from the world entirely. The details changed with each telling. Sometimes they were taken into the sky by angels. Sometimes they walked silently into the forest to meet their fate. Sometimes they simply stepped out of this life together. These accounts were never backed by evidence. Yet the sheer neatness of the village's abandonment, no disorder, no violence, seemed to support the idea of a calm, collective decision. But for every supernatural explanation, there was a more earthly and sinister counterpart. Some believed the disappearance was the result of foul play on a scale almost unthinkable. The most common version was that the residents had been coerced or forced to leave by outsiders, bandits, perhaps, or a group seeking to claim the village's resources. Proponents of this theory pointed to the mysterious benefactor who had funded Willow's Rest for more than a decade, suggesting that whoever had been paying for the village's upkeep might have had other motives. Perhaps debts had come due, or the benefactor had sold the land, and the new owners had no interest. in housing a population of non-working elders. Still, no valuables were taken, no livestock removed, and the absence of any signs of struggle continued to undermine the theory. The story of the railway worker's sighting soon became a focal point for speculation. His claim of seeing a line of pale-clad figures moving silent through the hills seemed to offer the only potential eyewitness account of the missing villagers after their disappearance. In his description, the figures did not speak, did not look up, and seemed to move with the same pace, as though following a shared purpose. Some argued this lent weight to the religious procession theory, others to the idea that they had been marched away against their will. The problem was that the sighting was never corroborated, and the man's reputation for occasional exaggeration made even those who wanted to believe him hesitate. Then there were the darker, stranger theories, ones that seemed to live entirely in the realm of folklore. Old mountain superstitions began to re-emerge. Stories of thin places where the barrier between this world and another could be crossed. Willow's Rest, with its isolation and quiet order, was the perfect stage for such tales. People spoke of lights seen in the woods at night in the months before the disappearance, of a low humming sound that carried on the wind, of strange carvings found in the oldest stones near the plateau. None of these claims could be substantiated, but they spread quickly, aided by the fact that no one could prove anything else. Some theorists combined elements of all the others, suggesting that perhaps a charismatic leader among the elders had convinced the others to follow them into the wilderness for a better place or final journey, only for something to go terribly wrong. In this telling, they were neither victims of violence nor supernatural intervention, but of misplaced trust. The problem, as always, was the lack of any trail. The surrounding forest had been combed for weeks without a single shoeprint, torn scrap of clothing, or dropped possession. It was as if the residents had dissolved into the air. There was also the strange matter of timing. The last known sighting of Willow's Rest's residents was not in the village itself, but on the mountain road, a week before the disappearance was discovered. A farmer traveling toward Milford claimed he had seen 3 elderly men and 2 women walking together down the road in the opposite direction. They had nodded politely, but did not stop to speak. He thought little of it at the time. Residents of the village occasionally traveled to nearby towns for supplies, but the detail took on new significance after the village was found empty. Were these 5 the first to leave? Were they messengers? Or had they been part of the entire group's departure? Their identities were never confirmed, and no trace of them was found afterward. As weeks turned into months, the theories became less about solving the mystery and more about keeping it alive. The absence of answers gave it a kind of mythic resilience. Every time one explanation was dismissed, another would take its place. Locals began to fold the story into their own traditions. Children were told not to wander too far into the woods, lest you walk the path of the elders. Travelers passing through were warned against staying on the plateau after sundown. Willow's Rest became a place people spoke about in lowered voices, not out of fear exactly, but out of respect for something they didn't understand. The official investigation, such as it was, ended without resolution. The county's final report described the disappearance as unexplained and without evident cause, a phrase so unsatisfying that it only encouraged more speculation. In the years that followed, a few amateur investigators tried their hand at solving the mystery, but they found only what the first searchers had found: silence, order, and the traces of interrupted lives. Theories remained, just that stories told in the absence of certainty, each one casting the vanished colony of elders in a different light. And so, the mystery of Willow's Rest remained untouched, a puzzle with pieces that never quite fit, waiting for anyone to discover the truth. In the days following the discovery of the empty village, the search for answers was not just a matter of speculation, it was also a matter of official record. County authorities, though unaccustomed to dealing with anything on this scale, were pressed into action by the sheer strangeness of what had been found. Yet almost from the beginning, there were whispers that not everything uncovered in those first days was ever meant to be seen by the public. The phrase government secrecy might sound grand for a disappearance in a small mountain settlement, but the way records vanished and accounts contradicted each other made even the most level-headed locals uneasy. The first hint of suppression came from the men who had been part of the initial informal search. When they returned to Willow's Rest later under the direction of the county sheriff, they noticed changes. In a few cottages, certain personal items were missing: letters from writing desks, ledgers from shelves, entire trunks removed from closets. These weren't the kind of things a thief would bother with. They were documents, papers, records of some kind. The communal hall's locked cabinet, which was known to contain the settlement's meeting notes and accounts, had been emptied entirely. When questioned, the deputies on scene claimed they knew nothing about it, suggesting that perhaps the papers had been moved for safekeeping. But no one in Milford ever saw them again. Official census records also began to show peculiar inconsistencies. The 1910 census listed 53 residents in Willow's Rest, but a revised document filed barely a year later, but dated as if it had been part of the original survey, listed only 48. The missing 5 names were not noted as deceased or relocated. They simply no longer existed in the official count. This might have been dismissed as a clerical error were it not for the fact that those same 5 names matched the descriptions of the group of villagers last seen walking down the mountain road a week before the disappearance was discovered. How locals wondered, could their names have been quietly erased from a record compiled years earlier? There were also the police reports, or rather, the fragments that survived. Early drafts written by deputies described the contents of several homes in detail, including the now infamous unfinished letter. But in the final versions, that particular letter was not mentioned at all, nor was the passage in the Bible left open on the table in the communal hall. Instead, the reports offered a strangely sterile account, noting signs of abandonment, but omitting many of the odd personal details that had so struck the original searchers. One deputy, speaking years later in confidence, claimed that he had been instructed to keep it simple and leave out anything that might start wild stories. The military's sudden and unexplained interest in Willow's Rest only fueled suspicions. 2 weeks after the disappearance became public knowledge, a small detachment of uniformed men arrived in Milford, claiming to be conducting a survey of the plateau and surrounding hills. They did not wear insignia that the locals recognized, and they declined all offers of assistance from townspeople. For 3 days, they went up and down the mountain, carrying surveying equipment and large canvas sacks. On the 4th day, they left without explanation. Whatever they had been doing, it was not reflected in any county record, and no one in Milford was ever told the results of their so-called survey. Some speculated that the government had long known of something unusual about Willow's Rest, perhaps, even before its founding, and had been waiting for an excuse to intervene. A few older residents recalled strange restrictions on hunting and logging in the area, dating back to the early 1900s. One man claimed his father had been fined for cutting timber on the edge of the plateau, told only that the land was reserved, for reasons that were never explained. Such recollections, though unverifiable, added a sinister undertone to the idea of official involvement. Even more troubling were the rumors about photographs. Several of the first men to enter the village brought simple box cameras, hoping to document what they found. A few images reportedly made it back to Milford, grainy shots of the communal hall, the cottages, and the untouched gardens, but then disappeared almost as quickly. One local photographer, who claimed to have developed some of the negatives, said that a man from the sheriff's office came to collect them, offering a vague explanation about keeping them in the case file. Those photographs never resurfaced, and none appear in the county archives today. These gaps and contradictions created fertile ground for conspiracy theories. Some believe the missing documents and photographs might have shown evidence of something symbols. Carved into the walls, strange markings on the ground, items of a nature too unsettling to share publicly. Others argued that there was nothing supernatural at all, only a scandal perhaps, financial mismanagement by the village's benefactor, or mistreatment of the residents that authorities had chosen to bury in order to protect reputations. The fact that no one could identify the benefactor in official records made this theory especially tempting. If the name never appeared, there was no one to question. The further people dug into the official account, the stranger it became. County property records, which should have shown the transfer of ownership when Willow's Rest was founded, were missing entirely for the relevant years. The book containing deeds for nearby land skipped an entire section of page numbers, as though a section had been neatly cut out. Requests for copies from the state registry returned only the response that no such records existed. To some, this was proof enough that something had been hidden, whether it was the identity of the landowner, the conditions of the settlements, founding, or some other detail lost to time. By the end of that first year, the official stance was that there was no evidence of criminal activity and that the disappearance was likely voluntary departure. This conclusion satisfied almost no one. Voluntary departure of an entire community, leaving food on the table and clothes in the wardrobe, defied both logic and lived experience. Yet the more people questioned it, the more firmly authorities closed ranks, insisting that there was nothing. To investigate further, requests from journalists and amateur researchers for access to the case file were denied on the grounds that it was no longer active and not in the public interest. Over the decades that followed, each new attempt to uncover the truth met with similar obstacles. Archivists claimed records had been lost in a fire or misplaced during a move. Officials denied the existence of certain files, even when multiple people swore they had once seen them. The pattern was always the same. Pieces of the puzzle were missing, and the missing pieces were always the ones most likely to shed light on the mystery. For the people of Milford and the surrounding towns, the secrecy became part of the story itself. Willow's Rest was no longer just a vanished village. It was a vanished truth, buried under layers of silence. Whether the government had hidden the facts to protect the public, to cover its own mistakes, or to conceal something far stranger, no one could say. What remained was the enduring sense that answers had once been within reach, only to be deliberately pulled away. And so, just as the villagers themselves had disappeared without a trace, so too had the records that might have explained their fate. Over the years, nature reclaimed what remained of Willow's Rest, but not in the way that swallows up all memory. The plateau where the village once stood is still accessible to those willing to make the winding climb, though the path is narrower now, tangled with brush and fallen branches. When the mist settles low in the valley, the climb feels longer, quieter, as if the air itself thickens with the weight of the place's history. The houses are gone, most of them dismantled by time, storms, and the occasional scavenger butt. Here and there, the bones of the village remain, stubborn against decay. Crumbling stone foundations lie scattered across the plateau like broken outlines of lives once lived. Some are barely visible under the moss and creeping ivy. Others stand waist-high, jagged, with corners that still define the shape of kitchens or bedrooms. It takes only a little imagination to picture where the rocking chairs once sat on porches, or where gardens once bloomed. Near the center of what was once the green, the largest foundation marks the site of the communal hall. It is the most intact, with 3 walls rising to shoulder height and a hearth still standing, blackened by a fire that went cold over a century ago. The orchard has gone wild, its orderly rows long lost to the spreading of seeds and the sway of seasons. Apple trees grow in irregular clusters, some gnarled and hollow, others still bearing small, sour fruit in late summer. Locals sometimes pick from them, though more than one has admitted they feel uneasy doing so, as if taking something left behind for the vanished residents. In the spring, when the trees blossom, the plateau looks deceptively peaceful, the soft pink and white petals drifting on the wind like snow. It is during these times that hikers report the odd sensation of being watched, as though the place itself is aware of intruders. Perhaps the most curious remnants are the markings on several of the surviving stones, particularly those used. In the original foundations, there are symbols carved deep into the rock. Some are simple crosses or lines, but others are far more intricate, interlocking spirals, geometric patterns, and designs that seem to suggest both mathematical precision and artistic intention. They are weathered, but the depth of the cuts has preserved their shapes through decades of rain and frost. No one can say with certainty whether they were made by the founders of Willow's Rest, by the missing villagers in their final days, or by someone who came after Dot. It is not only the stones that raise questions. In the surrounding forest, less than a mile from the plateau, there are small clearings where the undergrowth seems unnaturally thin. One in particular has a perfect circle of bare earth at its center, as if nothing will grow there. Local lore insists these spots are connected to the village's disappearance, though no evidence has ever been found. Some say the villagers met in these places for a final gathering. Others whisper about strange lights and sounds reported there. In the years after the village was found empty, the absence of burial records adds a final layer to the unease. Despite the community being made up almost entirely of elderly residents, there are no official documents, no headstones, no marked graves for any of them, not even for those known to have died before the disappearance. The founders' ledgers, which might have recorded such information, were among the many missing documents. It is possible, of course, that burials took place in unmarked plots in the surrounding woods, but if so, they have never been found. To some, this suggests that the residents of Willow's Rest always had a plan to leave, one that did not include leaving their dead behind. To others, it hints at something stranger, something that prevented anyone from being laid to rest in the usual way. Today, those who visit Willow's Rest rarely linger. Hikers describe an unnatural stillness that seems to settle over the plateau the moment they arrive, a stillness deeper than the ordinary quiet of the mountains. Even birdsong seems muted here. The wind moves through the trees, but the leaves do not rustle as loudly as they should. Time feels oddly suspended. Hours pass without notice, and shadows lengthen faster than expected. Some visitors leave offering small piles of stones, flowers, coins on the foundations, though no one can say exactly why. Perhaps it is respect, perhaps superstition, perhaps a way of acknowledging that the village is not truly gone, only waiting. What remains of Willow's Rest is neither fully alive nor entirely dead. It is a place caught between histories, one written in official reports that explain nothing, and another told in hushed stories passed from one generation to the next. The stones, the orchard, the carved symbols, they are fragments, clues without context, stubbornly resisting the erasure of time. And in their persistence, they ensure that the mystery of the vanished colony of elders will never fully fade from the mountains that still hold their silence.